Late one evening, Officer Jane Thompson cruised through the quiet streets of the city, her patrol car's headlights slicing through the darkness. She had just finished her last coffee of the shift and was looking forward to getting off the clock when the radio crackled with a new call, a disturbance at a convenience store on the edge of town. It wasn't a priority call, but enough of one to warrant attention, so Thompson made her way to the location. As she neared the store, she could see the flickering lights of the neon signs reflecting off the wet pavement from the recent rain. The night was colder than expected, a slight chill in the air that hinted at a change of seasons. She parked her car a few feet away and stepped out. The streetlights overhead, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. She could hear raised voices from inside the store, and as she walked toward the entrance, she spotted a woman standing near the counter arguing with the cashier. The woman's tone was sharp and angry, her arms flailing in the air as if to emphasize her point. The cashier was standing behind the counter, visibly frustrated, shaking his head and pointing toward the exit. The woman was holding a coupon in her hand, waving it in front of him. It looked like a typical dispute over a discount or a coupon that wasn't valid, but something about the intensity of the argument caught Officer Thompson's attention. It wasn't just the words, it was the energy of the situation, something in the way the woman was speaking that made Thompson instinctively brace herself. She stepped through the door and immediately assessed the scene. The woman was a black woman in her mid-30s, tall, with striking features, her face twisted in frustration. As she continued to argue, the clerk was visibly tense, and the other few customers in the store looked uncomfortable, trying to avoid getting involved. The atmosphere was thick with the tension of an impending confrontation. Thompson approached calmly, though her hand hovered near her holster, just in case. She was used to handling confrontations in stores and public spaces, but there was something about this one that made her pause. "Ma'am," Officer Thompson said, her voice steady but firm, "could you please step outside and settle this?" She gestured toward the door, trying to keep her tone neutral but authoritative. The woman turned sharply, her eyes narrowing, as if she hadn't expected to be interrupted. "Who the hell do you think you are?" she snapped. "You think I need to leave like some criminal?" She made a quick motion with her hands, as if dismissing the officer's presence. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Officer Thompson took another step forward, her instincts kicking in, her posture remaining professional, but her eyes scanning for any signs of escalation. "This isn't about who you are, ma'am. It's about keeping the peace," she said, her voice remaining even despite the provocation. The woman scoffed and turned back to the cashier. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, but when she turned again to face the officer, she had an edge to her voice. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. "You can't make me." At that moment, Officer Thompson felt the familiar tug of authority. The decision was clear. This situation wasn't de-escalating, and the woman wasn't backing down. She needed to take control. "It's not about making you go anywhere, ma'am. It's about the law, and you are disturbing the peace," Thompson said firmly, before moving to place the woman under arrest. The woman's expression changed almost instantly from defiance to confusion. "What you talking about?" she asked incredulously. And as Thompson moved closer to cuff her, the woman hesitated, but reluctantly complied, hands raised in surrender, not knowing that her arrest would ignite a chain of events no one could have predicted. As Officer Thompson guided the woman through the process of arresting her, the reality of the situation began to settle in. The woman, though still visibly angry, followed her instructions without resistance. Thompson's mind raced as she moved through the familiar motions of booking a suspect, her mind flickering back to the earlier tension in the store. The woman had been uncooperative, sure, but was an arrest really warranted for something so minor? Thompson couldn't help but wonder if she had overreacted, but she quickly pushed the thought aside. Protocol was protocol, and she had to follow it. The woman, still silent, didn't give Thompson much to work with as they entered the booking area at the station. She was calm now, her anger replaced by a cool, distant demeanor. She seemed almost resigned to the situation. Thompson didn't speak much either, though her thoughts were a whirlwind. What had she just done? The woman had certainly been difficult, but it was hard to shake the feeling that something wasn't right about the whole situation. As Thompson filled out the forms, the woman stared at the desk, arms crossed. She didn't seem like someone who belonged in a holding cell. But then again, neither did a lot of people. Thompson had seen people arrested for far worse offenses, but this felt different somehow. The woman didn't seem like a criminal. She didn't have that edge of recklessness that many people arrested in these circumstances had. She was simply upset. Then, as Thompson typed the woman's name into the system to run a background check, her eyes caught something that made her pause. The screen lit up with details about the woman, Sarah Johnson. The name rang a faint bell, but Thompson couldn't place it at first. She checked the file again, her eyes widening as she read the line, State Senator. She blinked, stunned, as her mind began to process what she had just read. The woman she had just arrested wasn't just anyone. She was a public official, a well-known figure in the local community, and a respected politician. Thompson's heart skipped a beat as she stared at the screen. She hadn't realized who she was dealing with when she made the arrest. If she had known, would she have acted differently? The thought felt like a punch in the gut. She had arrested a state senator, a woman with power, influence, and a platform. And now, the arrest would likely blow up into a massive media frenzy. Sarah Johnson, Thompson muttered under her breath. It was as if the name had been floating in the back of her mind all this time, and now it clicked. She had seen Sarah Johnson on the news countless times, heard her speak at political rallies, read her name in newspapers. Johnson had become a voice for the marginalized in the community, a champion for justice. And now Thompson had just hauled her into the station for something as trivial as a coupon dispute. Thompson felt her stomach churn. What had she done? She had treated someone who was not just a politician, but a role model and public servant, like any other person caught in a minor infraction. What would the public think of this? What would her colleagues think? The officer quickly typed in the contact information for Sarah's staff, hoping that someone from her office would show up soon to help clarify the situation. But she knew it was only a matter of time before the story broke, and there was no going back from this. As she stood in the booking area, looking at the woman who had so quietly and calmly been processed, Thompson realized just how much she had underestimated the situation. The impact of this arrest was far bigger than she could have anticipated. The news of Sarah Johnson's arrest spread like wildfire. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the story was everywhere. Local news stations were running breaking reports, social media was ablaze with heated debates, and the phone lines at the police station were ringing off the hook. Officer Thompson, who had just wanted to finish her shift and go home, was thrust into the center of a storm she hadn't prepared for. Sarah Johnson, a well-known and respected state senator, was no longer just a name on a police report. She was a symbol of power, influence, and the intersection of race, class, and authority. The public reaction was swift and intense. Supporters of Sarah flooded the news channels with messages condemning the arrest, accusing Officer Thompson of racial profiling and excessive force. Why was she treated like a criminal for a simple argument? One reporter asked on live television, "Is this what happens to black women in this city?" The community, already divided on issues of race and law enforcement, erupted. Some felt the arrest was an overreaction, an example of the kind of heavy-handed policing that had plagued marginalized communities for years. Others defended Officer Thompson, saying she was simply doing her job and following procedure. But what no one could ignore was the racial component. Sarah Johnson, a black woman in a position of power, had been arrested over what seemed like a trivial dispute. The optics of it were explosive. Protests began almost immediately. Outside the police station, a group of activists gathered, holding signs that read "Justice for Sarah" and "End Police Brutality." Some shouted for the officer's resignation, while others demanded that the department release a public statement addressing what they called racial injustice in the force. The hashtag Justice for Sarah quickly trended on Twitter, gaining traction across the country. News outlets picked up the story, interviewing Sarah's supporters, political allies, and colleagues who expressed disbelief that such an incident could happen to someone of her stature. Meanwhile, inside the police department, things were tense. Officer Thompson, once a relatively unknown figure in the department, was now a public target. Her colleagues were divided. Some sided with her, believing she had followed the proper protocol, but many others whispered behind closed doors, questioning whether she had acted too hastily. The idea that a state senator had been arrested over such a minor infraction felt like a mistake, an egregious error in judgment. Officer Thompson sat in her office, staring at the headlines as they scrolled across the screen of her computer. Her phone buzzed incessantly with text messages and calls from both reporters and family members. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected any asterisk of this. As she read through the messages, some supportive and others scathing, the weight of what she had done began to sink in. She had arrested a woman who had spent her career fighting for justice, advocating for the very people who now seemed to be demanding hers. Her mind replayed the events of the night over and over. Had she been too quick to act? Was it a moment of bias, a subconscious reaction to a woman who had stood up for herself in a way that didn't fit her expectations? Thompson's training had prepared her for countless situations, but nothing had prepared her for this one. She felt the pressure mounting, her career, her reputation, the legitimacy of the department, now all under scrutiny. As the protests grew louder and the media attention intensified, Thompson knew she had to address what had happened. But she also knew it wouldn't be as simple as offering a statement. The entire city was watching, and the road ahead was uncertain. She needed to figure out how to navigate the mess she had created. She had created, and whether she could make things right. Officer Thompson sat at her desk in the station, her head in her hands. She felt trapped by the consequences of her actions. The events of the night before had taken on a life of their own, spiraling out of control in a way she never could have anticipated. Every corner of the city was buzzing with the story of Sarah Johnson's arrest, and the backlash against her was growing. What had started as a seemingly routine encounter at a convenience store had exploded into something much bigger, something much more significant than she had ever expected. The first thing Thompson noticed that morning was the coldness from her fellow officers. Some avoided eye contact with her, while others spoke in hushed tones when they thought she wasn't listening. The murmurs were unmistakable, and Thompson felt the weight of their judgment hanging over her. She had become a pariah in the very department she had worked so hard to be a part of. Even those who had once supported her now questioned her decisions. It was a strange feeling, being the subject of such intense scrutiny when all she had done was follow her training, and yet there was a nagging voice inside her that wondered if something deeper had been in play. Did she act out of protocol, or had she allowed unconscious biases to influence her decision? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She looked up to find her sergeant, Lieutenant Daniels, standing in the doorway. His face was stern, his eyes serious. "Thompson, we need to talk," he said, stepping inside. Thompson nodded, trying to steady herself. She had been expecting this conversation, but she wasn't sure she was ready for it. Daniels didn't waste time with small talk. "You've seen the news, right?" he asked. "Of course," Thompson replied quietly. "We're getting pressure from all sides, community leaders, activists, even city council members. You've made a lot of people upset." Thompson took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. "I didn't know who she was when I arrested her," she said, the words coming out more quickly than she intended. "I didn't realize she was a state senator. I didn't think it would blow up like this." Daniels nodded slowly, his expression softening a little. "I get that, but it doesn't change the fact that you made a high-profile arrest of a public figure in a situation that could have been handled differently. People are asking why a politician was treated like a common criminal for a minor dispute. Why didn't you just diffuse the situation without taking it that far?" Thompson felt the sting of the question. She had replayed the incident over and over in her mind. If only she had handled it differently. If only she had been more aware of who Sarah Johnson was, would she have made the same decision? Would she have taken a moment to assess the situation before arresting her? "I thought she was being difficult," Thompson said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't see the bigger picture at the time." Daniel sighed, sitting down across from her. "We've all been there. We make decisions in the heat of the moment. But in this case, the fallout's bigger than you could have imagined. You've become the face of everything people are angry about right now. Racial profiling, police overreach, all of it." Thompson looked down at her hands, feeling the weight of his words. She had followed protocol, but it felt like something more had been at play. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice shaky. Daniel studied her for a moment before answering. "You need to own up to it. There's no getting around this. The longer you stay silent, the worse it will get. People want answers. They want accountability." Thompson nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the situation. She knew he was right. The only way out of this mess was to confront it head-on. But she also knew that doing so would require more than just a statement. She would have to acknowledge her own mistakes, confront the biases she had never fully recognized in herself, and begin a process of self-reflection she had never been forced to undertake before. Later that day, after hours of silence, Thompson made a decision. She called Sarah Johnson's office, not entirely sure what she would say, but knowing it was time to face the woman whose life she had altered in one fleeting moment. It was time to make things right, but Thompson wasn't sure if she was even capable of redemption. Still, the first step was to own up to what she had done. The questions now weren't just about the political fallout. They were about who she was and who she wanted to be moving forward. A few days later, Officer Thompson sat nervously at a small cafe on the edge of town. The place was quiet, just a few patrons sipping their coffee, lost in their own worlds. Thompson had arranged the meeting with Sarah Johnson, the woman she had arrested, and now she wasn't sure what to expect. The weight of the entire situation had only grown heavier since the arrest. Media reports, social media outrage, protests in the streets, and calls from her department demanding accountability. Everyone had an opinion, and it felt like everyone was watching her. But this meeting wasn't about the public outcry or the department. This was about Sarah, the woman she had wronged, and what she could possibly do to make it right. Thompson had been dreading this moment, unsure of how to face the woman who had become the face of a community's fury. What could she say to explain her actions? What words could possibly make up for the harm she had caused? She looked up as the door to the cafe opened. Sarah Johnson entered, her tall figure standing out against the more ordinary surroundings. Sarah was dressed casually in a light jacket and jeans, but her presence was undeniable. Her demeanor was calm, almost serene, as she made her way to Thompson's table. She offered a small, polite smile, but there was no hint of anger in her expression. No judgment, just an unspoken understanding that neither of them knew what to expect from this conversation. "Officer Thompson," Sarah greeted her, her voice warm but firm. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Thompson stood, shaking her hand, surprised by how normal it felt. Despite the scandal, despite the immense pressure from both sides, Sarah didn't seem like the fiery political figure that everyone had made her out to be. She was just a woman, sitting down across from her, extending an olive branch that Thompson wasn't sure she deserved. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Thompson said, her voice betraying the anxiety she felt. She gestured toward the seat. "Please sit." They sat in silence for a moment, neither of them quite sure where to begin. Finally, Sarah broke the quiet. "I don't want to drag this out," she said softly. "I'm sure you're under enough pressure already, but I need to hear from you. What made you arrest me? You saw who I was after you processed my name. What happened in that moment?" Thompson swallowed, her mind racing for the right words. She had rehearsed this conversation 100 times in her head, but now that she was here, it all seemed so inadequate. "Honestly, I didn't realize who you were until after the arrest," she said, trying to steady her voice. "I was responding to the situation at the store, and I just saw a woman who wasn't backing down. I thought I was doing what I was trained to do, but when I saw your name pop up, I realized I had made a huge mistake." Sarah nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving Thompson's face. "I get that," she said. "I get that you were just doing your job. But you have to understand how this looks, Officer Thompson. It wasn't just about the arrest. It was about me being treated differently. I've spent my career fighting for justice, fighting for my community. And then to be treated like a criminal for something so trivial, it felt like a slap in the face. I don't want special treatment, but I don't want to be treated like everyone else either, because I'm not everyone else." Thompson's chest tightened at Sarah's words. She hadn't considered the full weight of her actions. The symbolic impact of arresting a black woman in a position of power, someone who had spent years advocating for change. The fact that Sarah's identity as a politician and leader carried with it a level of expectation, but also a deeper vulnerability, was something Thompson hadn't fully grasped in the heat of the moment. "I never meant to treat you that way," Thompson whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't see you for who you are. I saw you as just another person who was being difficult, but I didn't take into account everything you've been through, everything you represent." Sarah studied her for a long moment before replying. "That's what this is about, isn't it?" she said. "It's about seeing beyond the badge, beyond the stereotypes, beyond the labels we put on each other. I don't want you to see me as just a state senator, as a politician. I want you to see me as a person, a woman, a mother, a daughter. I want you to see me for who I really am." Thompson nodded, feeling the weight of Sarah's words settle deep within her. It wasn't just about the arrest. It was about the greater picture of understanding, of seeing past the uniform, past the assumptions, and truly seeing the person in front of you. Thompson had failed to do that with Sarah, and now, in this moment, she was beginning to understand the depth of that failure. "I'm sorry," Thompson said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry." Sarah's expression softened, and she reached across the table, placing her hand over Thompson's. "I know you are, and I appreciate you being honest with me. This isn't easy, but it's the first step. We're all human. We make mistakes. The important thing is what we do after." Thompson looked into Sarah's eyes, a quiet understanding passing between them. For the first time since the incident, she felt like she was seeing Sarah, not just as a state senator or a symbol, but as a human being. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something bigger, something that could change both of their lives forever. The days following their meeting felt surreal to Officer Thompson. She had expected the conversation with Sarah Johnson to be tense, filled with anger and bitterness, but instead, it had been strangely civil. Sarah's grace and understanding had taken her by surprise. She had been given a rare opportunity, a chance to see the world through someone else's eyes, and perhaps for the first time, Thompson was beginning to recognize the weight of her own actions. The media frenzy continued unabated. News outlets still covered the arrest, but now the narrative was shifting. Interviews with Sarah Johnson, who had responded to the situation with calm dignity, took center stage. Her words were measured but firm, speaking not just about her own experience, but about broader issues of race, justice, and systemic inequality. She was a public figure, yes, but she was also a woman, a mother, and a community member. And now, in a strange twist of fate, her arrest had become a symbol of the very problems she had been fighting against. Officer Thompson, on the other hand, remained largely silent. Her department had asked her to keep quiet while an internal review was conducted. The media had painted her as the face of police misconduct, but there were no clear answers yet. She found herself reading every article, watching every interview, feeling the pressure building. The weight of public opinion was something she had never encountered before. She had been a good cop, one who followed procedure and did her job to the best of her ability. But now, all of that seemed irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was how she had affected Sarah Johnson and the community at large. One evening, a week after their cafe meeting, Thompson received a call at the station. It was from Sarah. "Officer Thompson," Sarah's voice came through the line, calm as always. "I know you've been through a lot lately, and I wanted to reach out. I've been thinking about our conversation, and I want to say thank you for your honesty." Thompson's heart skipped. She had expected a more formal statement, maybe even more distance from Sarah after everything that had happened. But this was different. Sarah's voice held no malice, only understanding. "You didn't have to meet with me," Sarah continued, "but you did, and I think that matters more than you know. It's hard for people in positions of power to admit when they're wrong, but you did." Thompson let out a breath, the tightness in her chest slowly easing. "I appreciate you saying that," she replied, her voice sincere. "It's been difficult, but I know I have a responsibility to face this, not just for me, but for the people who look up to you, who look up to all of us in different ways." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, then Sarah spoke again. "You know, the system isn't perfect. Far from it. But I don't want you to think that this is about shaming you. It's about learning from it. We can't change things by pretending they don't exist. The first step is acknowledging the issue. And you did that. Thompson felt a sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't about absolution, it was about accountability. It was about understanding growth and finding a way forward. But she also knew this moment was just the beginning. There was still so much work to be done, not just for her, but for the whole system. I want to do more than just acknowledge it, Thompson said, her voice firmer now. I want to make a difference. I want to be part of the solution, not the problem. Sarah's tone softened. I believe you. But actions speak louder than words, Officer Thompson. And I'm willing to help. I think there's a way we can work together to bridge some of these gaps. You've seen firsthand how much needs to change. Let's take this opportunity to do something about it. Thompson's heart raced. This was a real chance, to do more than just apologize, to make a lasting change. She had never expected this from Sarah, but now she realized just how much this moment could shape her future and perhaps the future of others. I'd like that, Thompson said, a renewed sense of purpose in her voice. I'd like to help, however I can. Good, Sarah replied. Let's start with a conversation. It's not going to be easy, but we're in this together now. We both have a lot to learn. As Thompson hung up the phone, she felt something shift within her. The weight of the past few weeks hadn't disappeared, but she was beginning to see a path forward. She didn't know where it would lead, but she knew she wasn't walking it alone anymore. In the weeks that followed, Officer Thompson began to transform in ways she never anticipated. The quiet conversations she had with Sarah Johnson weren't just about acknowledging past mistakes, they were about action. Sarah had become both a mentor and a partner in a journey Thompson had never thought she'd embark on. Their discussions grew deeper, touching on issues of policing, race, power, and the way systems perpetuate inequalities. Sarah wasn't just sharing her experiences as a politician, but also as a Black woman navigating a world designed to hold her back. Thompson, in turn, shared her frustrations as a police officer, her feelings of being trapped between her duty and the growing realization that her profession had failed countless communities. As the media attention surrounding the arrest slowly faded, Sarah and Thompson decided it was time to take action. They planned a series of town halls, starting with a meeting in the community where Sarah's advocacy had always been strongest, the predominantly Black neighborhood where Thompson had once made her arrest. The idea was simple. They wanted to create a space where members of the community, including law enforcement, could come together to discuss their fears, frustrations, and hopes for the future. The goal wasn't to erase the past, but to find a way to move forward. Thompson, still nervous about her place in all of this, understood the stakes. The residents of the community weren't just going to listen to her because of her uniform. They had seen the headlines, heard the stories. She would need to prove herself, show that she was willing to listen, not just talk, but genuinely listen. But there was something inside her now, something that pushed her forward. She couldn't undo the past, but she could be part of creating a new future. The first town hall took place in a local church, a place where many in the community found solace. The room was packed. Local residents, activists, and law enforcement officers, many of whom were skeptical. The tension in the air was palpable. Sarah opened the meeting, speaking with calm authority. We're here to have an honest conversation, she began, her voice firm but welcoming. Not just about what happened with Officer Thompson and me, but about the larger issue of trust. This isn't about placing blame or pointing fingers. This is about moving forward together. Thompson stood at the back of the room, feeling the weight of the crowd's gaze. She hadn't been able to shake the feeling that they were all judging her, evaluating whether she was genuine. But as the meeting progressed, something began to shift. One by one, community members shared their experiences, stories of police encounters that had left them feeling invisible, unjustly targeted, or fearful for their lives. Thompson listened, deeply moved by the vulnerability in the room. She had never truly understood the depth of the pain in the community until now. When it was her turn to speak, Thompson felt a lump form in her throat. She had never been one for public speeches, and the idea of speaking in front of people who had every reason to distrust her terrified her. but as she opened her mouth, the words came out raw and honest. "I don't have all the answers," she began, her voice steady but emotional. "And I know I've made mistakes, but I'm here because I want to learn. I want to be a better officer, a better person. And I want to make things right, not just for me, but for all of you." The room was silent for a long moment, and Thompson wasn't sure how it had been received. But then, someone in the back stood up. It was an older man, his eyes red with emotion. "You're trying," he said. "That's all we can ask for." And then others began to speak up, slowly at first, then more confidently. The conversation turned from anger to understanding, from blame to shared responsibility. Thompson realized that this wasn't just about healing the rift between her and the community, it was about rebuilding trust, one step at a time. As the meeting came to a close, Sarah approached her. "How do you feel?" she asked, her tone supportive but curious. "I don't know," Thompson said, still processing the gravity of the evening. "I feel like I'm starting to understand things differently. This isn't going to be easy, but I want to keep going." Sarah smiled. "It's a start, and that's all we need right now." That night, as Thompson walked to her car, she felt a sense of clarity. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time, she felt hopeful. She wasn't just an officer in a uniform. She was a person, someone who had made a mistake, but was now working hard to make amends. And with Sarah by her side, Thompson felt she could truly be part of the change the community so desperately needed. Months passed, and the efforts that Officer Thompson and Sarah Johnson had started together began to take root. Their town halls, once a daunting idea, became a regular space where community members and law enforcement could come together. The conversations weren't easy. There were heated moments, moments of deep discomfort, and plenty of silence where people struggled to find the right words. But through it all, Thompson never wavered. She attended every session, sat with residents who once distrusted her, and listened with an open heart, acknowledging the pain and fear they had endured for years. Slowly, her presence began to be seen differently. No longer just the officer who had made an arrest that sparked outrage, Thompson was becoming someone more, someone who was genuinely working toward change. She didn't have all the answers, but the community started to recognize the sincerity in her actions, in her willingness to be vulnerable and to make difficult choices. With each town hall, with each conversation, a small piece of the mistrust began to erode. But as much progress as she had made, the past was never too far behind. One day, Officer Thompson was called into her precinct for a meeting with Lieutenant Daniels. He had been supportive of her efforts to make things right, but there were whispers around the department. Not everyone was happy with how things were going. Some believed she was too close to Sarah, too invested in the idea of reform, and not focused enough on law enforcement protocols. The pressure was mounting again, but this time, it felt different. Thompson sat down across from Lieutenant Daniels, who looked at her with a mix of concern and caution. He didn't speak immediately, just studied her face as if waiting for her to speak first. "Lieutenant," Thompson began, "I know what you're going to say. I know there are people in the department who don't think this is the way we should be handling things, but I need you to understand, I'm not just doing this for Sarah or the community. I'm doing this for myself." Daniels nodded but remained silent. "I made a mistake," she continued, her voice steady but filled with conviction, "and I need to fix it. I can't pretend like it never happened. I've spent my whole life following orders and doing things by the book, but I've realized that sometimes the book is wrong. The system is flawed. We all need to acknowledge that if we're going to move forward." For a moment, the room was silent. Then Daniels leaned forward, his gaze intense but not unkind. "Thompson, I can't deny that things have changed since you've been working with Johnson. You've made a lot of strides, but there are those who think you've strayed too far from what's expected. I'm not here to judge you, but you need to be careful, not just with the community, but with the department. People notice everything." Thompson nodded, her mind racing. She knew he wasn't wrong. This was a delicate balance. She couldn't let the department push her back into the mold she had once fit so easily, but she also couldn't let the community down. "I understand," she said quietly, "but I can't go back to being just a cog in the system. I need to be part of the change. I've seen firsthand the harm that blind obedience to the system can cause. I don't want to be complicit anymore." Daniel seemed to digest her words for a moment before responding. "Then you need to be prepared for the consequences. Not everyone will be on board, and it's going to be hard. But if this is the path you want, it's yours. Just don't expect it to be easy." Thompson sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of the decision she had made. The road ahead would be uncertain, and there would be resistance, both from within her own department and from people who still doubted her sincerity. But for the first time in a long time, she felt clear on her purpose. She was no longer just an officer. She was an advocate for change, for understanding, and for the justice she knew needed to be redefined. That night, as Thompson left the precinct, she looked up at the night sky, the weight of the world pressing on her shoulders. But she wasn't alone. She had the support of Sarah, the community, and, in this moment, the knowledge that she had the courage to fight for what was right. As she walked down the street, she thought of the future. There was still so much work to be done, but she knew she had found her path. This was her redemption, not just for the mistakes she had made, but for the opportunity to make a lasting difference. And with every step she took, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The work had only just begun.